Okay, hi. This is one of the early videos for our class on Chinese or East Asian cultures on religion and philosophy. This is a basic introduction to classical China. In particular, the takeaway from the video today is going to be about sort of dates and centuries. History can be difficult because of the dates, but remember in humanities, I really want you to get it within about 1,000 years, so I think you can usually do that. One tricky thing, and particularly because the period we're going to look at right now, the Han Dynasty, occurs around the same time as the rise of the Roman Caesars in the Roman Empire. That is right around the time of Christ. And when I say the time of Christ, that's significant for scholars. Why is that? Because the way our calendar works is you sort of count down to a year zero, which sort of nominally was around the time of Christ. There's a very long and interesting history about getting all these calendars coordinated over the centuries. So there's a whole literature about that if you're curious. But in any event, if we're in the year 2021 right now, then 2021 years ago, there was the year one of the Common Era, what is CE on these slides. And before that, you went in the other direction. Before that was the year 1 BCE, before the Common Era, and then 2, and then 3. So it counts backwards. That can be a little tricky. So for example, the first century of the Common Era, right, is year 1 through 100 around the time of Christ. But the first century BCE is the year 90, is the year 10 to 1, right? Counting down from higher numbers. So you have to get used to that. So I just flag that for you. Another thing when we're looking at ancient history, whether we're looking at the pre-Bronze Age cultures of Mesopotamia, or whether we're looking at European history, or sub-Asian Indian history, or Chinese history, wherever we look, it's not the Flintstones. There are a lot, Chinese history is in terms of dynasties. A number of Chinese dynasties and kingdoms existed prior to the period that we're going to be looking at today. We're not looking at the very original period. There are many prior dynasties. And what we're looking at today is the beginning of the imperial Chinese nation, when China sort of consolidated and became the kind of cultural unit that we know it is today. Where this is happening in central China, there was, as I say, settlement and people and a culture for a long, long time back, at least till the beginning of the second millennium. So, so that's not our focus. What our focus is, it really is the last 2 centuries of the first millennium BCE and the first 2 centuries of the first millennium of the Common Era. So the first and second centuries of where we are, and then the 2 centuries before that, going back 200 years before the time of Christ when we start. So, okay, so that's basically what we're looking at. And as I said, I mean, the main takeaway there is to see how those dates work. But, and let's look at our title screen then. Where's this? Is that it? Okay. Oh my. Okay. We're gonna have to do it like this. Sorry about that. Okay. Classical China. I tend to get better as the semester goes on with this technical stuff, so don't worry about it too much. So right, the kingdom in the middle of the world, sometimes calling themselves the Middle Kingdom. One of the things that we're talking about today is that you had a large area and you had warlordism, a lot of conflict, and so that all got kind of unified. So I think when we look at Chinese political thinking, Chinese attitudes towards the relationship between the individual and society, and I think when we compare East and West, you know, one of the first things we notice is that there is definitely a difference, in as much as when we look at Chinese political and social thought, there's more of a sense that the individual should be subordinated to some extent to the collective. I'm not passing judgment on whether that's right or wrong. I'm just pointing out that's a clear difference in sort of the social and political cultures of, say, China and the Enlightenment European West. Again, for better or for worse. Okay, so now one thing about studying ancient history, and I like, let me even step out of it for a second to say this. I like to see how far back I can go and still have stuff that's well sourced, stuff that's, let's do share the screen. Stuff that's reliable, stuff that is canonical, well documented, well authorized, and yet it's really old. How far back can we go and still look at sources that are good? Now, how does it work? How do you study ancient philosophy that way? How do you study ancient history that way? Through the texts. If we want to study Hinduism, we have to look at these ancient texts, the Rig Vedas, the Upanishads, the epics. If we want to study Christianity, we have to, and the Abrahamic monotheism of Europe, we have to look at the Torah, we have to look at the Old Testament, the New Testament, and so on. And similarly with China, I mean, one way that we learn the history is we learn the texts. We already have a video that you can watch in the series now on the I Ching, the earliest text and certainly one of the most important sources of China, and that does go back somewhere to the second millennium, the I Ching, by the way. We have a video on that. And I think, and there is a video posted in this series right now already on the yin yang symbol of Taoism. But so you've got the I Ching, and then you've got a number of other books. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that right now up front is that when we look at the Han Dynasty, the Qin Dynasty and the Han Dynasty, what we will see is that it's almost unique in history here that this culture really got to sort of define itself. It understood that it needed to edit itself, and it did. So I want to explain that to you further. So you have the Qin Dynasty, which lasts for 28 years, and then the Han Dynasty, which lasts for over 400 years. Actually, there is a break, I think, of about 19 years when they get overthrown in the middle, so you call the East Han and the West Han. I'm not going to bother with that because we're having a very general introduction here. The main calendar takeaway, chronology takeaway you want, we've already seen, is that it's the last 200 years of BCE and the first 200 years of the end of the Common Era. Those 400 years are really the Han Dynasty. It's the Qin Dynasty. Why do we mention that? Because it's critically important. Emperor Qin, who was the king for almost the whole length of the so-called dynasty, achieved amazing things, and we really wouldn't have a unified, consolidated modern Chinese nation, or at least the one that we have, without him. So here's the other thing that probably, since I'm an English-speaking person, we're here in the Western Hemisphere, it's more likely anyway that that you have the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, and that's really the classical period of Europe. And if you know a little bit more, you know that when the Greeks were, they were around the middle of the first millennium, around the 5th centuries. And then when the Romans were, and you had the Roman Republic, and then the Caesars rose to the 1st century before Christ. And then the first couple of centuries after Christ is when you have the whole gang of Augustus and Nero and Caligula and all the wonderful people who were emperors of Rome. By the way, similarly, when we look at the Han Dynasty, a dynasty that lasts for 200 years, it is a really absolutely full of intrigue and assassination and murder, and everybody taking out their close relatives in order to gain power. And it's really full of that stuff. It makes the Borgias look tame by comparison. So if you like that sort of thing, again, not time to go into that here, but there's a very, very colorful, shall we say, history, the political history of the machinations during the Qin and Han Dynasties. So how do we remember this, that when the Han Dynasty is? Because as I say, it's really important. I'm going to show you today, right now, why that's important. Well, you remember it because you can, again, you can remember that the Roman Empire comes up in the first 2 centuries before Christ. The Roman Republic is taken over by the empire in that last century. And then the first 2 centuries of the Common Era are Roman Empire centuries, the century, for example, of Nero, as I mentioned. And this Han Dynasty of China roughly overlaps that. Now, again, is this the very beginning of China? No, not at all. You have maybe 2,000 years of archaeologically documented history prior to this, and including things like the text of the I Ching, which goes back maybe even 1,000 years before this. And the other important texts we're going to talk about today, the Analects of Confucius and the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, are from prior to the Han Dynasty, but they're sort of codified in the Han Dynasty. So the last bullet point there, the grand narrative, is this, that you have this sort of warring states period coming out of the middle of the first millennium, and then the Emperor Qin, with his hard hand, unifies things. And having done that, he gives way to the Han Dynasty, which is the sort of golden age of China, one of the most productive cultural times of China. Another thing that I've said before in these videos, when we're studying cultural history, you know, culture is like a flower on the vine. You know, the vine is doing its thing and it's growing, the plant is growing, and eventually conditions come together and you've got this great blooming and blossoming. You don't find culture spread out evenly. You find these peak moments when everything sort of comes together and you have a tremendously productive culture for a time. Everything comes to be and passes away, and it's not sort of uniform and continuous. So again, coming into about the middle of the second half of the first millennium, and notice the walls too, the Great Wall of China. This Emperor Qin also was the one who sort of started to unify and have a plan for the wall. These are sort of regional walls, again, guarding against these nomadic steppe inhabitants with their horses who were riding down on the agricultural settlements of the Chinese. This is something going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. The Great Wall of China that you see it if you're a tourist going over today was actually built maybe 6th century to 10th century of the Common Era, not as long ago, in the centuries before the Renaissance. But it was Emperor Qin who said, well, we're going to have towers, we're going to have guards. And by the way, that was also for collecting taxation and controlling movement as much as military defense. So it was he who first unified, you see there, in a very brief period in the 3rd century of the first millennium, right around the time of the Alexandrian conquest, which I think is also interesting. And you see there sort of the rough extent of that Qin dynasty. That's again, late 3rd century, the first millennium. And then that gives way to the Han Dynasty. And again, Emperor Qin was a rough guy in a rough time, but he managed to pull it all together and pacify and unify this very, very large area. So the Han dynasts just inherited that, and they were the ones who really benefited from all this foundational work that Emperor Qin did in consolidating power. Right, there he is. He was a king. You had the Warring States period, and he took over. This title emperor actually comes from him because they wanted something that was sort of the meta king word, and that's what they came up with. He both consolidated, but he also was a terrible oppressor. And so, for example, there's something that's even known in the history books as the Great Burning of the Books. And in a sense, then there was also a reaction against Emperor Qin in the early decades of the Han Dynasty, when people said, well, we have to protect this stuff. We're not going to be like him and burn the books. He abolished feudalism and tried, to some extent quite successfully, to establish meritocracy. This is similar to sort of the czarist governments of the last couple centuries before the Russian Revolution. If you're a young person, you can pass these exams. You have to read these books and then pass these exams, and you can get a job in the civil service, which sort of makes you a kind of middle-class person. And he standardized things. He standardized measurement. He standardized the currency, which was very important. And in fact, the currency standards that are adapted this time last for hundreds and hundreds of years. And he also built that Terracotta Army. The Terracotta Army that we're going to look at here, I'll show you some slides of it because it's pretty wild. It's pretty cool looking. These people are practicing uh, funerary customs when their leaders die, similar to the ones that we see, for example, in ancient Egypt. They have very, very rich tombs that are testaments to the wealth and power of the deceased. So again, you have the Silk Road, the Chinese trading routes also are very old. The beginnings of those go back about to the beginning of the first millennium, about to the time right after the Bronze Age collapse of 1200 BC, another very important date to remember. And then he starts to unify them when he's there at the end of the 3rd century. And again, these big walls with the big towers that you see if you go over there are really actually, I think, more like 7th century, 8th century constructions. There are over 8,000 soldiers. There are hundreds of horses complete with chariots. They have real weapons. They have armor. There are rooms and all kinds of stuff. The whole complex hasn't actually even been opened yet. In fact, this was only discovered in 1973, if you can believe that. And he had himself buried with a whole Terracotta Army, complete with horses. Han Dynasty art features horses a lot. We'll look at some more of that. The soldiers themselves, there are about 20 different types, and then they paint the faces and so on to make them even more different. It's like an army set. And here you can see different kinds, different hats, different faces. As I say, there's about, I think about 24 different types that they made. And there's a hell of a lot of them. My mom and dad saw this a long time ago, and they said it was quite impressive. I'd love to go see it sometime. They have done a tour of them, I think. All right, so the Han canonization, the canon. Literature students will know that the canon is sort of all the books that are kind of considered to be the important cultural books, the touchstone. That's the canon, the literary canon. What happened, again, you had, for the Han Dynasty, you had a unification of a number of states that had been autonomous from each other prior to them. So they get this. They have now a sort of blank slate. And not only that, but Emperor Qin had been a sort of destructive force because he had been suspicious of other sources of authority. So as I say, he had engaged in book burning and suppression of scholars and other things for his own political reasonings. And this also then caused a backlash, and people were very concerned to preserve a lot of these old texts and a lot of these old teachings. Both the Confucian teachings and the Taoist teachings come from maybe 200 or 300 years prior to the first generation or two of the Han Dynasty. But it was the Han Dynasty that compiled them, published them, protected them, had them sort of edited, put the government's imprimatur on them, also made substantial changes, for example, to the I Ching, which is an ancient text which has always gone through a lot of changes depending on the time and place where it is. And it became a much more cosmological, philosophical text in the hands of the Han editors. We're going to have a video on Confucius, and we're going to have at least one more video on Taoism and the Tao Te Ching. And we will have a video on Mencius, on classical Chinese philosophers. And as I say, there's a video on the I Ching already posted in this series. So we're going to go into those all at much greater depth. The takeaway from this today is that it was the Han Dynasty that saved, preserved, and actually organized, aggregated, edited these texts. So to a great extent, the whole sort of profile of classical Chinese civilization that we have is a creation of Han Dynasty thinkers. They had that opportunity to decide which books were the important books and codify them. As I say, we're going to talk about Confucianism in a whole nother video. It's very important social theory that you should know about. In a nutshell, Confucian, and why talk about Confucius right now? Because we see from the Han Dynasty's origins in the unification of the warring states, we see this attitude, the source, I think, an important source of this attitude, that building up and preserving the state and not having a distinction between the culture and the state is something that I think is a reflection of Chinese origins in this sort of a violent unification process. So Confucius is absolutely is the quintessential Chinese thinker. He says that the individual is a product, a reflection of, dependent on the larger society, and particularly the parents, the ancestors, and the political structures in which this individual is living. Here's the idea, because let me step out of it for a sec. Western liberal political theory is very much centered on the individual. And even in its notion of systems dynamics, the idea is that there are a lot of sort of micro events happening down at the atomic level, the level of the individual. Think of Adam Smith's invisible hand model of market economics, for example. And liberal Enlightenment European social theory tends to be social contract theory. That is, that it's because ultimately the individual enjoys the right to the pursuit of happiness and so on, that we are entered into these contractual political relationships with each other. Chinese political theory is completely different from that. Chinese political theory, Confucian political theory, again, the idea is that you think of an ordinary, I'll just make this quick, think of a really simple hunter-gatherer society. You have very, very few social roles. You have, maybe there's men, there's women, there's adults, there's children, that maybe there's a head man, and that's about it. I mean, so if you live in that group, your notion of individuality is very limited. You only have one or two things that differentiate you from anyone else in the group. But think about being in a society like ours, where even in a classroom in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico, where I teach, and everybody's from the island for the most part, but still, even there, the things that people are studying, the families that they come from, their religious affiliations, cultural affiliations are all very different. And that is why modern mass society features individuality. So the thesis here is, this is a Confucian thesis, that actually it's large society with differentiation of roles, social stratification, and it's very, very many touchstones of identity, which we sort of, some of them we choose, some of them are given to us. That's what makes us individuals. So the paradox is that it's mass society itself that gives rise to the individual, and the individual depends on mass society. I think that's a sort of essential Confucian insight, and goes a long way towards understanding the Chinese instinct to think that it's the collective, the well-being of the collective, that's going to trump the well-being of the individual, which, as I say, is one of the things that makes that political tradition the most different from the European Enlightenment liberal tradition. All right. So let's get back. And Confucius then, of course, is the perfect thinker for a society and a culture that's trying to unify a lot of people over a large area and bring people together and cultivate an identity. Okay, an identity that is cultivated, self-consciously developed. And I would also add then later on that a fundamental Mahayana Buddha, it's Mahayana Buddhism that comes in over the mountains with Bodhidharma around this 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era there, and then you get Buddhism in the mix. And that kind of Buddhism is really going to stress that everything is one, a oneness, that everything depends on everything else. And of course, that's going to dovetail perfectly with this Confucian idea that the individual really is a product entirely, and a reflection entirely of the larger collective. Taoism is a different story. Taoism is a folk tradition. Taoism includes a lot of different things. I'm not sure. Originally, the Taoism is really what you call a religion. It's a spiritual tradition, one that includes, for as I say, magic and spells and stuff, an old folk tradition, with a lot of different things happening in it. Yeah, we call these things religion, but each one of them is different. They're not at all the same in terms of what kind of manifestation of culture they are. Taoism is a folk countryside tradition. And as such, it's always been a source of pushback. It was a source of pushback against the emperors. It was a source of pushback against the Communist Party, still is. It's some of these groups in China today have their roots in these old sort of Taoist practices. So you had a big upswell of Taoism in the, it's actually sort of the 3rd century, 2nd century BC. I think it doesn't matter. That's very fine grained detail. But Confucianism was sort of official state doctrine. It wasn't a religion, but Taoism was accepted as a sort of authorized religion, which made it into a religion, because all Taoism was a sort of, a kind of culture, a kind of attitude, a kind of identity. And it was in this, what I'm calling this canonization of Chinese things, that the Han leaders really thought was important, that you get both Confucianism and Taoism as such. Again, Confucianism is a social philosophy. It's not a religion at all. It's not very spiritual. It's social theory. Confucius is a social theorist like Thomas Hobbes. Taoism, a broad, folky tradition. where you can find people who will make you into toads and live forever and stuff like that. But also you can find votive temple worship, ancestor worship, classic example of ancestor worship. And Buddhism, which is arguably also not necessarily religion, but a kind of practice. And these things come to be called the three legs of the stool. Be careful, because if you're talking to a Taoist scholar from China, they might not like it if you start talking about Buddhist this and Buddhist that. And vice versa, maybe, but but the fact is, these things have a lot of things in common. They reflect the age. And I think it's a great tribute and something that makes classical Chinese thinking very rich, that you had Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, all kind of sloshing around and all sort of available and all present in the royal courts throughout these centuries. Something that makes it the Han Golden Age, the golden age that it was. The first two bullet points I've been talking about quite a bit. Emperor Qin put it all together. He said, okay, we're gonna standardize the place. We're gonna unify things. We're gonna bring things together, bring things under central government, central law, central taxation, and he did that. And he was good at that. But then for a long time after that, the Han Dynasty was very good at doing interesting things and having fun and so on. Because of that, you get a period of sustained economic prosperity, amazing scientific innovation. In fact, as a matter of fact, there's actually a whole historical literature asking how come it was that science and engineering didn't reach full strength first in China, because it looks like it ought to have. And there's actually many books written on that topic. Certainly on the surface of the planet, right around the time of Christ, there wasn't any more sophisticated culture on the planet than the Middle Kingdom, the Chinese culture of the Han Dynasty of that time. There were excellent astronomers throughout the world at that time, but the Chinese astronomers, for one thing, because of their attitude towards what they were looking at, the Mesopotamian and then Greek and Roman European astronomers, and Persian astronomers, Babylonian astronomers, were interested in predicting the future. And of course, they, like all astronomical traditions, were coming out of agrarian motives. So they were very interested in irregularities and star charts, and those Babylonian star charts are really good. But the Chinese were interested in also They have the same agrarian interests as everyone else, of course, but there are also anomalous things happening. So nowadays, astronomers who are studying things like supernovas consult the Chinese texts because the Chinese have records of a number of these events. The one that formed the Crab Nebula, for example, that the Europeans didn't make that great records of. We're also going to have, we will have a video on, on Chinese art, a number of them. So we'll get back to the ceramics and so on. Paper making and printing, dynamite, rifles, firearms, navigation, rudders, steering a ship with a rudder, all sorts of innovations in mathematics. I mean, just all kinds of stuff. So a fascinating time. Equally, I mean, as I say, if you're a Western person, you may know just how interesting it is to study Greek and Roman stuff. Well, this Han Dynasty stuff is the sort of Chinese equivalent, and the literature, for example, the poetry that we're not going to go into, but very legendary. Interestingly, we continue to see this kind of axial age phenomena, whereas in the middle of the century, we got people like Siddhartha Gautama in India and people like the pre-Socratics and Socrates in Greece. And we see this sort of philosophical awakening. And then a couple of hundred years later, we see following in that this huge growth of the Han Dynasty, the Middle Kingdom in China, the Mauryan Empire and King Ashoka in India, and the rise of the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean, all happening at the same time. Okay. Now, look at the piece on the left there, and you see it's got a little sort of a palace made out of the ceramics there. These often are funerary objects from tombs, and often the home or the palace of the person would be recreated. Some of these tombs also have large wooden and ceramic models of buildings. So that was just something that's present in Chinese tombs, these architectural things. And then you see something looking much more like a kind of Levantine piece on the right. And as I say, we'll take a closer look at that. Ceramics. Not a lot of Roman painting survives, but a lot of Han painting survives, the same reason that a lot of Egyptian painting survives, because a lot of it was in tombs. And of course, we learn a tremendous amount from looking at this stuff. This will be a painting from 100 or 200 years before Christ. Military campaigns, very colorful. You see you have the high banner so people can see where you are and who you are. And that's a beautiful piece. Lacquerware is interesting. Where does the lacquer come from is kind of interesting because it didn't have any polymers or industrial processes. Chinese mostly got it from the lac tree. It's mostly made from sap. There are also insects that give us lacquer. So lacquerware is really interesting and it's very beautiful. And when we do Chinese art, we'll pay some attention to lacquerware. I want to study it some more, find out about it. The process of making the lacquerware is interesting. Really nice bronze casting. This is like Persian bronze casting of the time, and very intricate, very fine. Oh, that is that. So we will look at the bronze casting as well. So, so not a lot, I mean, but just a very, very basic introduction to classical China. And classical China, well, I'll just go through it one more time. You think about classical Europe, you think about the ancient Greeks and Romans, and then you could be more specific about when they were in the first millennium, 1,000 years before Christ. Rome is, of course, right at the time of Christ, coming up first of Caesar's coming up the century before Christ, and then and then the fall of Rome is in like the 5th century after Christ. This is around the same time. The Han Dynasty, the last 2 centuries of the first millennium BCE and the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. So right around the same time as the Roman Empire, and that's sort of how you remember it. And so again, there were lots of Chinese people and cities and tribes and things prior to this. But what we have here is not the first dynasty, but rather the first emperor. We see the Chinese nation coming together, and it comes together with the unification in the middle of the 3rd century, Emperor Qin. All right. So that's very, very basic stuff. Now we're going to take a look. Mostly we're going to look at, as I say, we have a study of the I Ching already up on the boards there, and then we're going to look at Confucius. We're going to look at Taoism, the I Ching, the Tao Te Ching, I'm sorry. We're going to look at Mencius and a couple of other classical Chinese philosophers. And then we'll work our way into the introduction of Buddhism to China, and then we'll learn what Buddhism is, and then and take it from there. A very, very rich topic. So much. My only problem with this class is I don't even know where to go, because there's just so much to think about. But we'll try and stick to philosophy for a while, and art, philosophy and art, and a little bit of history. There's too much history to grind through it. Just can't do it. So I got to kind of glaze over that. I'm looking for the philosophy and the art and the religion. All right. I'll see you next week.